In 2011, a study revealed a mysterious reduction of roughly 700 million tons of CO2 from Earth's atmosphere between the 13th and 14th centuries, over double the UK's annual carbon output. Given our current climate concerns, this news is highly relevant for scientists striving to curb human carbon emissions. However, this dramatic atmospheric CO2 decrease 800 years ago wasn't due to some lost ancient technology. It was, surprisingly, caused by Genghis Khan. His secret to carbon reduction: mass slaughter. As Genghis Khan's Mongol horde swept across Asia in the 13th century, they were directly responsible for an astonishing 40 million deaths, over 10% of the global population. At the time, this widespread devastation allowed vast expanses of previously cleared land to reforest, effectively sequestering enough carbon to noticeably lower atmospheric CO2 and potentially cool the planet. Impacting global temperatures through mass murder is undeniably remarkable, yet it's just one of the countless ways Genghis Khan reshaped our world. His ascent from being abandoned by his tribe at age 8 to forging an empire that, at its peak, spanned almost 20% of Earth's land and encompassed a quarter of its people, is arguably the greatest rags-to-riches tale ever told. But Genghis Khan was far more than a rampaging warlord. He was a statesman centuries ahead of his time and arguably the greatest leader of men in history. This is the story of Genghis Khan, the man who nearly ruled the world. Typically, I begin biographical videos with background information like birth details, but for Genghis Khan, I can't. The simple reason is nobody truly knows. It may seem odd that such fundamental information about one of history's most influential figures is unknown, but much of Genghis Khan's life is similarly shrouded in mystery, and for good reason. When he rose to power in the late 12th century, the Mongols lacked a writing system. This meant no contemporary accounts of his early life were ever recorded. In fact, nearly everything we know about those early years comes from a single book, The Secret History of the Mongols, and we have no idea who wrote it, or if it's entirely accurate. So, here's what we think we know about Genghis Khan. He was born in either 1155, 1162, or 1167, depending on the source. Not a strong start, I know, while no one is certain which date is correct, or if any are. The Mongolian People's Republic celebrated his 800th birth anniversary in 1962, making 1162 our best guess. Regardless of his birth year, he wasn't initially called Genghis Khan but Temujin. Legend says he entered the world clutching a blood clot, a clear omen of a mighty warrior. His father, Yesugei, was the chieftain of a powerful tribe. His mother, whom Yesugei had kidnapped and married from the neighboring Merkit tribe, a brutal but seemingly common dating practice of the era. As the son of a prominent chieftain, Temujin enjoyed a relatively privileged youth, learning the ways of the steppe, primarily riding and hunting. But like all of us, Temujin eventually had to grow up and settle down. For him, this happened around age 8, when he was betrothed to Berta, the daughter of a rival chieftain. This match was intended to unite the two clans, but plans derailed when Yesugei was poisoned by members of another clan, the Tartars. With rudimentary healthcare in 12th century Mongolia, he died 3 days later. His father's death was a personal tragedy for young Temujin, but it also decimated his future prospects. Yesugei left 6 children, none old enough to rule. This created a power vacuum. A Mongol tribe typically comprised several clans, essentially extended families. Yesugei belonged to the noble Borjigin clan, but the powerful Taichiud clan was also part of the tribe. With Yesugei gone, the Taichiud seized control. To eliminate potential threats, they expelled Yesugei's surviving family members, leaving Temujin and his relatives to fend for themselves. The Mongolian steppe is an incredibly harsh environment, a place even seasoned survivalists would avoid. For a fatherless family alone in the wilderness, it should have been a death sentence. Yet they survived, initially foraging for meager, roots and berries, later supplementing their diet with fish and game. As Temujin and his siblings matured, tensions escalated. Beyond typical teenage squabbles, a more sinister undercurrent existed. None of Yesugei's children had forgotten being abandoned, and several, including Temujin, harbored dreams of reclaiming their birthright. Genghis Khan would become renowned worldwide for his terrifying ruthlessness toward enemies, and here, the boy who would become a legend offered history its first glimpse of what was to come. As Yesugei's eldest son by his chief wife, Temujin believed he should lead the family. However, his half-brother, Behter, 2 years his senior, also had a legitimate claim. After repeated disagreements over dividing their meager food supply, Temujin decided to act. With his younger brother, he ambushed and murdered Behter in cold blood when he was alone. While fratricide typically makes family gatherings awkward, Temujin's siblings seemed forgiving. After Behter's death, Temujin was universally accepted as the family head and quickly embraced the role. Even at 14, people noticed him. It wasn't just his burgeoning skills as a hunter and fighter, which were common for boys his age on the steppe. There was something about him. Despite his youth, when he spoke, people listened, though not everyone was pleased. When Yesugei's former tribe learned of Temujin's growing reputation, they immediately recognized potential trouble. It was only a matter of time before the young warrior returned to reclaim what they had stolen. Rather than wait, his old tribe, still under Taichud control, launched an offensive, attacking Temujin's camp and taking him prisoner. It's fascinating to consider that if they had simply executed him then, world history would be entirely different. Instead, the tribe's chieftain opted for the James Bond villain approach, keeping Temujin alive to display his power. Being a massive Bond fan, probably, Temujin simply bided his time, awaiting the inevitable escape opportunity. And it presented itself. In a departure from the classic Bond villain playbook, the tribesmen paused their taunting of Temujin to get. Lacking lasers or buzzsaws, they secured Temujin with a large wooden board locked around his neck, leaving him under the watch of an armed guard. But a plank of wood and a single guard were insufficient to contain the boy who would become Genghis Khan. Temujin waited until his guard was distracted, then mustered his formidable strength, smashing the unsuspecting tribesman over the head with the board before escaping into the night and eventually rejoining his family. At 15, Temujin was officially considered an adult by Mongolian law. Now grown, he decided it was time to conquer the world. But first, he had to visit a girl. Despite not having seen him since she was 8, the now teenage Berta was thrilled to see her old flame alive and well. They soon married, as Yesugei had intended. During the festivities, Berta's father presented Temujin with a lavish black sable cloak, the most prized fur on the Mongolian steppe. We've all received unwanted gifts, and the soon-to-be Genghis Khan was no exception. He re-gifted this prized piece of Mongolian haute couture to an old friend of his father's, Togrul, Khan of the powerful Keretes tribe. Being something of a fashionista, probably, Togrul was delighted and quickly took Temujin under his wing. It was fortunate he did, because soon after, Temujin's camp was attacked by a raiding party from the Merkit tribe. Yes, that Merkit tribe. The same one from whom Yesugei had kidnapped Temujin's mother all those years ago. It seems they hadn't forgotten and had returned for revenge. This time, they weren't after Temujin's mother. After 5 children and a hard life as a single mother on the steppe, she wasn't exactly wife-stealing material. No, the Merkits came for Temujin's young bride, Berta. successfully kidnapping her and marrying her to one of their own. A classic "you steal my wife, I'll steal yours" situation. We've all been there. Temujin had been off gallivanting in the mountains with his friends during the raid, but upon learning what happened, he immediately sought Togrul's help. I can only assume the old warlord looked really good in black sable because he not only agreed to help, but offered to personally lead an army of 20,000 men to rescue Berta. He also persuaded Jamuka, an old friend of Temujin's who had risen, to lead the Jadaran tribe to commit another 20,000 men to the cause. I'm guessing it was around the time those 40,000 angry tribesmen appeared on the horizon that the Merkit wife-nappers realized their mistake. They were utterly crushed by Temujin's impromptu coalition, and Berta was saved, though with one minor complication: she was pregnant. We still don't know for sure if the child was Temujin's or the son of the Merkit warrior Berta was forced to marry, but Temujin did the honorable thing and raised the child as his own. Despite the dubious paternity, the battle with the Merkits firmly established young Temujin as a significant force on the Mongolian steppe for the first time. He had secured powerful allies and was rapidly building a formidable army of his own, but just a year after Berta's rescue, things went wrong. Again, this time it began with a falling out. Temujin and Jamuka had been childhood friends, and like many young lads growing up together, a friendly rivalry existed between them. However, when power and ego are introduced, even the warmest rivalries can turn bitter. According to the most common version of the story, tensions peaked when Jamuka made a disparaging remark about Temujin's choice of camp. Words were exchanged, fists were shaken, mothers were insulted, and by the time the two men parted, they were mortal enemies, the 12th century Mongolian equivalent of Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort. Neither could live while the other survived. The inevitable confrontation came in 1187 when their respective forces met at the Battle of Dalan Baljut. Considering that the man who became Genghis Khan is one of history's most famous generals, you might expect Temujin to have easily defeated Jamuka. Surprisingly, it was almost the complete opposite. Despite evenly matched armies, Temujin suffered such a crushing defeat that he was essentially expelliarmused clean out of the history books. For the next 8 years, his whereabouts remain largely unknown. He simply vanished. Many historians today believe he was forced to flee across the border into China, where he was enslaved by the Jin dynasty emperors. Others think he simply bided his time in a remote corner of the Mongolian steppe, slowly rebuilding his forces. Whatever he was doing during his gap decade in 1195, Temujin returned to the steppe with one thing on his mind: vengeance. Through unclear means, he had somehow acquired a shiny new army and quickly joined forces with his old friend and mentor, Togrul. Temujin 2.0 was an entirely different beast from the one defeated by Jamuka 8 years prior. He had always been ruthless, but as he waged war across the steppe with Togrul at his side, he escalated that trait to a whole new level. He wasn't content merely to defeat his enemies in the field, he sought to utterly destroy them. After defeating a rival tribe's warriors, Temujin would take their women as spoils of war, and then order his men to slaughter all but the very youngest children. This staggering brutality served two purposes. Not only did it prevent the inadvertent creation of future avenging youths, but it also had a profound psychological impact on rival tribes. The message was crystal clear: anyone who opposed Temujin and lost could expect no mercy. They and their families would be erased from history. Unsurprisingly, many tribes joined Temujin's cause without a fight. With each victory, Temujin's nascent Mongol horde was slowly transforming into one of the most formidable fighting forces ever assembled. But this transformation wasn't just military, it was also social. Like many societies before and since, Mongol tribes were structured by social class, with the most important roles given to those with the highest standing. However, Temujin did things differently. He promoted people based purely on ability. The most famous example is probably Subutai. Born the son of a blacksmith in most Mongol tribes, he would have had no chance of rising through the ranks. But in Temujin's revolutionary meritocracy, Subutai became the Mongol Empire's chief military strategist. Today, he is widely regarded as one of the greatest generals ever to have lived, credited with conquering more territory than any other military commander in history. Another way Temujin disrupted norms was in how he divided the spoils of war. Traditional Mongol custom dictated a large portion of loot for the chieftain, with the rest shared among the men. But Temujin divided his spoils equally, taking more for himself than for the lowliest soldier. These and many other reforms worked spectacularly well. Temujin's ever-growing horde was both deadly and fiercely loyal. But there was one minor drawback. Broadly speaking, Temujin's reforms created a fairer society where the common man had the same opportunities and rewards as a high-born prince. This was excellent if you were a common man. The established Mongol nobility, however, were less enthusiastic. As far as they were concerned, Temujin wasn't just uniting the Mongol tribes, he was initiating a full-scale revolution. This shift in long-established social norms prompted some of Temujin's oldest allies, including old sable-cloak Togrul, to turn against him. But it was far too late to stop the juggernaut. Togrul was defeated, and by 1204 all that stood between Temujin and the unification of the Mongols was one man, Jamuka. Temujin's greatest frenemy had been appointed Khan of the remaining 13 tribes, still not on Temujin's side. It was only a matter of time before the two men met on the battlefield once more. After the Battle of Dalan Baljut, Jamuka had proven himself to be a rather unsportsmanlike victor. Rather than, say, patting himself on the back, he brutally murdered 70 of Temujin's soldiers by boiling them alive. As you can probably imagine, that did not go over well with, well, anyone, which is why when Temujin reappeared in 1195, many of Jamuka's most important generals immediately defected to Temujin. Jamuka still commanded a larger force, but the defections tipped the balance. While the battle's details are lost to history, the outcome was clear. Temujin secured a decisive victory, and Jamuka was decapitated. By 1206, the scattered tribes of the Mongolian steppe stood united under one ruler. To honor his historic victory, Temujin was given a new name, one that still echoes through history 800 years later: Genghis Khan. Scholars are somewhat divided on the precise meaning of this impressive-sounding name. It's quite possible Temujin simply thought it sounded cool, but the most common explanation suggests it meant something along the lines of universal ruler. While on the subject of names, you might have noticed that Genghis Khan is sometimes also called Genghis Khan. The confusion arises because Mongolian and English have very different alphabets, and transliterating between the two is a tricky business. Genghis was the original anglicized version of Temujin's assumed name, but Chinggis is actually closer to the Mongolian pronunciation. So many modern scholars prefer that version. Anyway, by the time Genghis, or Chinggis, united the Mongols, he had been at almost constant war for close to 30 years. And in those 3 decades of warring, winning, and losing, the artist formerly known as Temujin had gained something: priceless experience. Genghis Khan's Mongol horde is often portrayed as an unstoppable force that steamrolled its way across Eurasia through sheer numbers of men and horses. But the truth is, most of the time, the Mongols were actually massively outnumbered by their enemies. Genghis Khan didn't win because his army was bigger. He won because it was better organized, better led, and filled with men who were almost pathologically loyal. The Mongols also possessed unique advantages few other militaries in history can match. Countless armies, ancient and modern, have been defeated not on the battlefield, but by simple logistics. Feeding and supplying a large army is difficult, and as you advance further into enemy territory or face changing weather conditions, it becomes even harder. But the Mongol army was different. These men were expert hunter-gatherers, perfectly adapted to nomadic life on the unforgiving Mongolian steppe. As long as they spread out when on the move, they were essentially self-sufficient. Their horses grazed on available vegetation, and the men hunted, fished, and foraged as needed. History has shown that an army's supply line is often its weakest point, but the Mongols had no supply lines. They simply didn't need them. Add this remarkable flexibility and self-sufficiency to a massive force of unprecedentedly mobile and extremely deadly fighters, and you had an incredibly lethal combination, and the rest of the world simply wasn't ready for it. Speaking of the rest of the world, with all of the Mongolian steppe now under his command, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the lands beyond. First, on the Mongol menu was the Chinese Imperial dynasty of Western Xia, a key part of the Silk Road, and, more importantly, an entry point into the rest of China. To an outside observer, Genghis Khan's invasion of Western Xia would probably have looked like a huge tactical blunder. For one thing, the Mongols were outnumbered 2-1, but there was also the minor detail of the entire Gobi Desert lying between them and the enemy. The idea of a giant army of 30,000 horsemen crossing the world's sixth largest desert might sound insane, but while the Mongols weren't precisely desert dwellers, they were incredibly hardy. When times got especially tough, they would drink milk from their horses to survive, and when times became, oh crap, we're all going to die tough, they would open a vein on their horse's flank and drink the blood. So thanks to some equine vampirism, the Mongol horde safely crossed the desert. But what they found on the other side was just as daunting. The tribes of the Mongolian steppe were nomadic. They moved their camps with the seasons to ensure a constant food supply for themselves and their livestock, especially their horses. But by their very nature, nomadic tribes don't tend to be overly fond of building things. So when Genghis Khan arrived in Western Xia, spoiling for a fight, he faced something he'd never seen before: walls. Okay, so Genghis Khan probably knew what walls were, but the fact remained that being a nomad, he didn't have much experience dealing with them. And that was a problem because in Western Xia, walls were absolutely everywhere. When the Great Khan's mighty horde arrived outside the thick walls of the capital of Zhongxing in 1209, it was clear that a direct attack was impossible. Instead, the Mongols were forced to camp outside while their mightiest military minds tried to figure out their next move. Destroying the walls wasn't an option because the Mongols had never developed siege weapons. Understandably, you don't exactly need a trebuchet to break into a yurt. After double-checking that horses definitely couldn't climb walls, worth a try, one of the Khan's commanders devised an intriguing and absolutely brutal idea. If they couldn't break through the walls, why not just murder everyone inside instead? To that end, the Mongols began building a large dam across the mighty Yellow River that flowed alongside the city. The plan was simple: divert the river so it would run straight through the middle of Zhongxing, drowning every man, woman, and child inside. Fortunately for the people of Zhongxing, the tent-dwelling Mongols weren't exactly the world's greatest engineers. While they did succeed in diverting the river, instead of engulfing the city as intended, they managed to flood their own camp. Not Genghis Khan's finest hour. Still, in the end, it was only a minor setback. Despite having far more soldiers, the Western Xia army was poorly led and scattered across the country, with the bulk of their men far away on the southern border. They were simply no match for the mighty Mongol war machine, and after suffering a series of defeats in 1210, Western Xia surrendered effectively becoming the first vassal state of the world's newest empire. Genghis Khan wasted no time pushing deeper into China and the territory of the powerful Jin dynasty. As we've already seen, it's likely he had spent time as a slave under the Jin emperors after his defeat by Jamukha. If that was indeed the case, the time had come for his revenge. And you know what they say? Revenge is a dish best served by 75,000 men on horseback, murdering everyone in sight. If invading Western Xia had been a bold move, taking on the Jin dynasty was practically suicidal. By some counts, the Mongol army was outnumbered 8-1 by their Jin counterparts. Not only that, but Jin territory was defended by the legendary Great Wall of China, though luckily for the Mongols in those days, it was more of a fairly decent palisade of China, and they eventually made it into Jin territory without too much trouble. As in Western Xia, the Mongols still had to figure out how to attack all those cities with inconveniently placed massive walls, including the Jin capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing. But this is where the brilliance of Genghis Khan's meritocracy truly began to pay dividends, because it was largely the son of a blacksmith Subutai who figured out what to do next. He realized it was ultimately pointless for the Mongol army to attack the larger Jin cities without siege weapons. It would take too long and cost too many lives. Instead, he suggested they do the exact opposite and attack everything else. Guided by Subutai, the Mongol army went on an absolute rampage, tearing across Jin lands and annihilating absolutely everything not protected by a wall. They burned fields and razed villages. They murdered tens of thousands of peasants and took tens of thousands more prisoner to use as human shields against Jin soldiers. When they encountered larger towns, they would attack with lightning speed, capture the settlement, then immediately retreat, forcing the Jin to expend time and energy reoccupying strategically unimportant territory. For the Jin, it was like fighting smoke, really angry smoke. The result was utter chaos, and refugees soon clogged the streets as food supplies dwindled. Suddenly being ensconced behind high city walls didn't feel quite so safe anymore. At the same time, Genghis Khan was learning. Sooner or later, he would have to figure out how to capture large cities, which meant developing siege weapons. Since none of his men had any idea how to do that, he instead began covertly recruiting siege engineers directly from the enemy. Soon enough, Jin siege experts were teaching the Mongols how to build catapults to breach the walls of their own cities. This willingness to learn from the people he conquered would become a defining trait of Genghis Khan's empire. In addition to siege weapons, the Mongols acquired written language from the Uyghurs and gunpowder weapons from the Chinese, along with a host of armor and weapon upgrades from the various peoples they conquered. Despite Subutai's chaotic warfare in the countryside and the Mongols' ever-improving siege skills, Genghis Khan was unable to completely defeat the Jin, and in 1215 he returned to the Mongolian steppe, with China proving a tough nut to crack. For the time being, he instead began to look westward to the empire of the Kara Kitai. A few years earlier, in 1213, the Kara Kitai dynasty had been overthrown in a coup staged by a man named Kuchlug. As it happens, Kuchlug was a former prince of the Mongolian steppe who had been forced to flee west when Genghis Khan defeated his tribe. Kuchlug wasted no time making his mark on his new empire, and in 1216 he attempted to expand it by attacking the nearby city of Al-Malik. This turned out to be a monumentally terrible idea for two reasons. One, Al-Malik was under the governorship of the Karluks, vassals of the Mongolian Empire. And two, the city was ruled by Genghis Khan's grandson-in-law, and if there was one thing you really didn't want to be doing in 13th century Central Asia, it was murdering members of Genghis Khan's extended family, as Kuchlug was about to discover. The great Khan promptly dispatched 20,000 warriors to liberate Al-Malik and hunt down Kuchlug. As usual, the Mongols were outnumbered, But, also as usual, it didn't matter. Kuchlug suffered several heavy defeats, and soon enough, entire cities were defecting to the Mongols, though for once it had nothing to do with their fear of imminent destruction. You see, Kuchlug was a Buddhist, and after gaining power, he had begun ruthlessly persecuting the local Muslims. Genghis Khan, on the other hand, had realized early on that religious persecution would only cause him unnecessary headaches. Instead, he allowed the free practice of any and all religions within his growing empire. Considering that freedom of religion isn't exactly a given in many parts of the world even today, it's fair to say this policy was centuries ahead of its time. Between military victories and countless defections, the Mongols swiftly conquered the vast Kara-Kitai Empire in under a year, granting Genghis Khan huge swathes of land across modern-day China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. By this point, I assume the world's cartographers had all gone on strike, citing impossible working conditions. Thanks to the Mongols' ceaseless victories, the world's borders were changing almost weekly, and after the assimilation of the Kara-Kitai Empire by the Mongol Borg, one of those brand new borders now lay between two of the world's great superpowers, the Mongol and Khwarezmian empires. After a solid 30 years or so of almost non-stop war, Genghis Khan had apparently had enough of fighting, because for once he didn't approach his new neighbors with bows blazing. The Khwarezmian Empire was a wealthy center of culture and learning that lay along an important section of the Silk Road. So rather than attempt yet another invasion, Genghis Khan decided to try and forge a peaceful relationship with the empire's powerful Shah. In 1218, he dispatched a grand caravan of some 450 merchants carrying steel, silk, and other valuables to establish a trade route between the two empires. When the merchants arrived in the city of Otrar, the local governor was absolutely delighted with the riches he saw before him. So delighted, in fact, that he decided to simply take them for himself and murder all the merchants who had brought them. Spoiler alert, things are not going to end well for the greedy governor. Genghis Khan was on the other side of Asia at the time, fighting his old foes, the Jin. But when he heard what had happened to his trade caravan, he immediately dispatched a diplomatic envoy directly to the Shah to demand an explanation. Now, I can only assume the Khwarezmian top brass hadn't been paying attention to global events over the previous decade or so, because it seems they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with.
Rather than do the sensible thing and beg for mercy, the Shah unbelievably escalated by murdering, or in some cases mutilating, the Mongolian diplomats. Spoiler alert, things are not going to end well for him either. As you can probably
imagine, when our friend Genghis heard about this latest insult, he absolutely lost his mind. Despite being in the middle of a minor war in Jin territory, he essentially dropped everything and rode west. Genghis Khan had shown incredible ruthlessness during his years uniting the tribes and the subsequent wars of expansion, but his campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire was something new. This wasn't about expansion, it was about revenge. The Mongol horde devastated the Khwarezmian Empire in what remains to this day one of the bloodiest military campaigns in all of human history. Genghis divided his army into 5 separate forces that operated independently, appearing seemingly from nowhere and striking with lightning speed. Any cities that resisted the Mongol horde, and several did, were utterly annihilated. In some cases, entire populations were slaughtered to a man, and by some estimates a total of 15 million people were killed during the campaign. In just 2 years, the black hole that was the Mongolian Empire had devoured another meal and grown correspondingly. Oh, and if you're wondering what happened to our friends, the governor of Otrar and the Shah of the Empire, allow me to tell you.
The man who initiated this whole crazy business by murdering the Mongolian merchants was captured by the Khan's men and executed. But there would be no swift beheading in his case.
No, as punishment for his greed in stealing the Mongolian trade goods, the governor was put to death through the unimaginably painful process of having molten silver poured into his eyes, ears, and mouth. Yeah, that'll do it. As for the Shah, he went into full retreat, fleeing from the advancing Mongols as if all the devils of the seventh circle of hell were hot on his heels, which I suppose, from his perspective, they basically were. It's thought that he made it as far as the Caspian Sea, where he died having dysentery. Seriously. With another remarkable victory under his belt, Genghis Khan headed back east to China, where a rebellion was in full swing in the lands of Western Xia. But by now, he was an old man, and somewhat unexpectedly, his prodigious strength was finally about to fail him. Exactly what killed Genghis Khan remains unknown to this day. Considering how much war he had waged in his 6 and a bit decades on God's green earth, it would have been fitting for him to have died in battle. But no. Until relatively recently, it was generally believed he fell ill after being thrown from his horse during a hunt. But more recently, scholars have speculated that he may actually have died from bubonic plague. Incidentally, it's thought to have been the Mongols who brought the Black Death to Europe during the siege of Kaffa as part of one of the world's earliest examples of biological warfare. But that's a story for another day. Whatever it was that killed him, in 1227 Genghis Khan was no more, but not even the death of its founder could stop the juggernaut that was the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan's descendants would continue to build on his work for the following 140 years. At its peak, the empire would cover more than 9 million square miles, that's almost 2.5 times the size of Europe, and contain more than 100 million people, about 25% of the world's population at the time. The Mongol Empire remains, to this day, the largest contiguous or interconnected empire in history, and the second largest overall behind the British Empire of the early 20th century. Genghis Khan died almost 800 years ago, but it seems that 8 centuries haven't quite been enough for the world to figure out exactly what to make of him. He's often been portrayed, especially in the West, as a ruthless and bloodthirsty warlord intent on conquering the world by any means necessary. But every villain is a hero to someone, and it turns out there are really quite a lot of someones who see Genghis Khan as a truly revolutionary leader whose brutal methods were simply a product of their time. As is usually the case, the truth is probably a shade of grey that lies somewhere in between those two black and whites. There's no denying that he was one of the most charismatic and successful leaders in history. That he achieved everything he did after being abandoned by his tribe at the age of 8 is genuinely almost unbelievable. By all logic, he should have starved to death on the Mongolian steppe before he even reached adulthood. And yet somehow he not only survived, he went on to found one of the largest empires in history. Not only that, in addition to all the conquering, he also encouraged international trade, promoted the spread of ideas across the world, supported freedom of religion, revolutionized warfare, and built a genuine meritocracy that celebrated ability, not birthright. Of course, there's also no denying that Genghis Khan was incredibly brutal when he needed to be, and probably sometimes simply when he wanted to be too. He believed in utterly destroying his enemies to ensure they would never pose a threat in the future. And he was prepared to follow through on that belief by basically murdering everyone in sight. Ultimately, it's difficult to judge the deeds of a man who lived 800 years ago. By modern standards, he was a genocidal land-grabbing maniac. But then again, so was everyone else you learned about in history. Class, whatever your views on the man, the myth, the legend, what isn't up for debate is that Genghis Khan was one of the most influential human beings ever to have lived, a force of nature who dramatically changed our world in ways that are still being felt today. Thanks for watching.